gargoyles were viewed in two ways by the church throughout history. On the one hand, gargoyles were used as representations of evil. It is thought that they were used to scare people into coming to church, reminding them that the end of days is near. It's also thought to give people some assurance that this evil was kept outside of the church walls, so therefore they were safe inside of the church. So they represented evil, so demons to scare people into church, but also represented paganism. They don't always have to be creatures, so I've got a couple different examples up here. These are from Notre Dame, but this one right here is actually from Scotland, and you can see that it's a human, or at least a humanoid creature. This is Reims Cathedral from Reims, France, and it dates to the 13th century. Building began of this church after 1210, which, surprise, surprise, there was a fire, and so then it was time to build a new church. Work continued until 1311, when the towers were left unfinished, as we can see today. The cathedral was restored in both the 16th and then again in the 20th century. It did survive World War I, although it had been hit by some 3,000 shells, but still stands. What we see in this cathedral is really that exploitation of the Gothic pointed arch. It seems like every element in this building is comprised of a pointed arch. And so when we look at these, here's these very dominant pointed arches. And in fact, there's so many pointed arches on here that it almost makes the building feel like that it also will end in a pointed arch, especially if those towers had been finished. Now this photograph is taken from a little bit of skewed perspective, but not much. When you stand in front of it, I think you still get this kind of sense of verticality and this sense of the pointed arch kind of pulling you up there. We see standard Gothic features like, those towers, that pointed arch, of course, the rose windows. Here's some great example of lancet windows. We also see the 3 portals that are also iconic of the Gothic style. We see that the entire building seems to be covered in sculpture. In a departure from tradition, Mary actually dominates the central portal of Reims Cathedral rather than Christ. Remember, we'd been looking at tympanums where we saw usually Christ in the Last Judgment. But here we see statues and reliefs of the Virgin Mary, and also the Virgin Mary as depicted as the Queen of Heaven. The presence and the dominance of Mary in the decoration of this cathedral reflects the growing popularity of her cult during this time. Towards the top of the cathedral, right here, you can see it right here as well, this is a close-up here, we have this horizontal band. And inside of this horizontal band, it's an arcade really, with pointed arches. But inside of them we have depictions of the French kings. Now Reims was actually special to the French kings because it was the place where French kings their coronations took place. Reims is an example of what we call high Gothic architecture, and this is basically just an evolution of the style. As we can see when we look at the exterior of this building, it is much more ornate than what we're looking at with the Cathedral of Notre Dame. The building seems almost like not to function as a building. Of course it does function as a building, that's its whole point. But when you look at the facade, it feels so sculptural, and it really reminds you of the Roman triumphal arches. The entire building just seems to be more of a monument than an actual functional building. You can see that they use deeper porches here, and they also use one of what becomes known as a standard Gothic design, these trefoils and quatrefoils. So the trefoils are these 3-lobe designs, and the quatrefoils are these 4-lobe designs. Details of the facade are stretched out to really emphasize the verticality, and again that's further kind of accented with these pointed arches. And remember here in the tympanum before, pretty much everything we were looking at, we've been looking at a lot of tympanums of the Last Judgment. Well, remember those are made of stone. Here they've taken away that stone and they've replaced it with stained glass. So now the stained glass is comprising our tympanums. This is just kind of a further evolution of the Gothic style to try to get more and more light, less and less stone into the building. So here's a close-up of the portals. On the central doorway jamb, there is a group of women. They're actually right here. Well, a group of women and an angel. And they depict the stories of the Visitation and the Annunciation. So the Visitation is when the Virgin Mary visits her older cousin Elizabeth, who is pregnant with John the Baptist. And the Annunciation is when the angel comes down and tells the Virgin Mary that she's pregnant. Now, scholars think that these, and here's a close-up of these sculptures, that these 4 statues were carved by 3 different sculptors from different times, from 1230 to 1255. So this part right here is depicting the Visitation. So we have Mary here, and we have Elizabeth here. And the artist who's creating the Visitation was a sculptor who was probably influenced by classical statues. Remember that Reims had been a Roman province before it ever came to be France. So there's likely a lot of Roman art all over the place. So they got to see this classical Roman and Greek arts. So it seems that this artist was probably influenced by that. So we have figures that look like ancient Roman figures. They have these strong swaying hips. They are heavy figures. They have full faces and a little bit of verism here. Look, you can see the wrinkles on Elizabeth's face because she's meant to be a little bit older. So we have the full faces, the drapery that forms the body. So you can see that the body is completely revealed beneath. I mean, you can't see anything of the skin or anything, but you can see the shape of the body beneath this drapery by the way that it's pulled. The figures are in motion. We can see that Mary and Elizabeth seem to be interacting, seem to be gesturing to each other. In previous jamb sculptures, these figures were usually isolated. They didn't interact. But now we have these sculptors, these figures that look like they are actors in a biblical narrative. So where we have these very Roman matron-looking figures with that hint of verism. Over here on this side, the Annunciation, we're first going to look at Mary, this Mary right here. She is kind of quiet and graceful. If you look at her body, it completely contrasts to this Mary here. She basically looks like a column herself. The drapery does not really reveal much about her body, maybe just a hint of her being a woman, but that's really it. She has a very slender body. She has kind of inwardly pulling gestures, whereas the other two seem to be more involved. She has more refined features, a very kind of strong chin, and this really contrasts to the bold Visitation Mary. So I would call this sort of more like classically influenced, classically Roman influenced, and this one I would say more Romanesque looking, maybe more medieval looking, but definitely a departure in style here. And then we have the third style, which with Gabriel. So Gabriel is actually the newest figure. He is elongated. He is the most animated. He's graceful, and he shows the trend of the French court at the time. So they're getting away from classical figures like this, and even from Romanesque-looking figures like this, because this seems to be, you can see his body beneath the drapery as the way that it makes him have a little bit more form than this column-like drapery. And he also has a sense of motion, the way that he's pulling his drapery to reveal the shape of his body. But the French court at this time was getting away from these classical figures and showing a more northern influence, so looking towards the Netherlands region. We would call this maybe the Gothic, or more likely the international Gothic style, and that becomes very prominent with the French court. Now, evidence says that these figures were moved around, but all the sculptures were originally painted and gilded. And here's a nice close-up of Gabriel and that Romanesque medieval-looking Mary And you can see how animated his face looks. He's pretty excited. I mean, he's telling her that she is carrying the Christ child, and he's pretty excited, where she looks obviously a little confused and disturbed. But especially in comparison to her, he has much more refined, delicate features, where she has this very strong jaw. The next church we're going to talk about is Sainte-Chapelle, which is in Paris, and it dates to the 13th century. Construction began on a new palace chapel in Paris to house Louis IX's prized collection of relics from the Passion of Christ. So he had like the crown of thorns that Christ wore, and he also had the image of Odessa. And these were very important holy relics. Originally, this was part of the king's palace, and it's located in the present-day administrative complex in the center of Paris. Now, the whole purpose of this building is, one, of course, to function for the king, but also to house the precious relics that he had gathered. So the building is meant to resemble a giant reliquary. It's built in 2 stories with a ground-level chapel, which we're looking at here, that is accessible from a courtyard, and then a private upper chapel, which we're going to look at next, that could only be entered from the royal residence. The ground-level chapel that we're looking at here has narrow side aisles, but then, as you can see, it's very elaborately adorned. There's vibrant colors, a lot of use of gold as well. But here is what the upper level looks like. The upper level is a single room with a western porch and a rounded east wall. You enter the upper level after climbing a narrow spiral staircase, and you emerge into this kaleidoscope room with shimmering lights in all colors. If you look carefully at this image, you can see that the walls have been reduced to clusters of slender painted colonnettes framing tall windows filled with color. So they've basically gotten rid of all the walls, and the whole thing is glass. The windows are 49 feet high, 15 feet wide. These were the largest designed at the time. We also have in the interior painted statues of the 12 apostles, and they stand between the window sections. So here you can see the stained glass here, and here are the apostle, or one of the apostles there. The windows contain narratives and symbolic scenes, like we have the Nativity, the Passion of Christ, the Tree of Jesse, and the life of John the Baptist. This church is known as, it's described as the sub-style of the Gothic, which is the Gothic rayonnant, and it is the radiant French Gothic style that becomes part of the French court style. Some of the hallmarks of this style to identify it is daring engineering. You can see that with the lack of walls here. It's basically they're using these walls as tracery, really. Exquisite sculpture, which we looked at here. Very vibrantly painted. This is kind of nice that we get a view of sort of how these things would have been painted. So when we look at a lot of exteriors, they're not well preserved, and even though they would have been painted, they look very dull today. But here you can see the colors they were using. So daring engineering, exquisite sculpture, and painting in vast expanses of stained glass.